Okay, picture this. A philosophical text written way back in the 1920s that somehow, almost impossibly, manages to answer the absolute most cutting-edge questions of our modern era, right? Today, we're diving into a seriously fascinating intellectual journey. I mean, it's pretty rare to find a piece of writing that doesn't just age well, but actually seems to anticipate the debates of the future. We're going to trace a century of shifting paradigms, looking at how the intense intellectual debates of the past 100 years have transformed, evolved, and yet, at their core, remained surprisingly consistent. So, we're starting with a massive contrast here. On one side, you've got the 1920s, right? An era totally obsessed with materialism and positivism. And positivism is basically this rigid belief that only scientifically verifiable physical facts matter. Like if you couldn't measure it in a lab, it just wasn't real, period. But then on the other side, we have the 2020s, our era, dominated by huge questions around artificial intelligence, quantum consciousness, the whole digital frontier. The source material we're unpacking in this explainer asks us to consider how one singular philosophical framework manages to connect these totally disparate worlds. Honestly, how does an argument built during the age of steam engines hold up in the age of algorithms and neural networks? Well, when you look at intellectual history from a bird's eye view, a really striking pattern emerges. You start to see that different decades just keep producing new packaging. But beneath that glossy exterior of modern terminology, we're honestly looking at the exact same old arguments. As society advances technologically, sure, the specific vocabulary changes, the trendy scientific disciplines shift, but those fundamental, massive philosophical questions about existence, origin, and consciousness, those remain stubbornly anchored in place. They just get dressed up in whatever the latest scientific trend happens to be. Just look at how the paradigms shifted over a single century. We start off in the 1920s with that foundational materialism. Then the conversation really picks up speed moving into the 1960s and 80s with this massive rise of a new wave of skepticism. By the 1990s and 2000s, this gets highly publicized through celebrity thinkers who were hyper-focused on evolutionary biology. But then the 2010s pivot sharply away from biology and look out to the cosmos, relying heavily on theoretical physics. And finally, boom, we arrive at the 2020s, staring down the barrel of AI and quantum mechanics. We're going to walk through this entire conceptual journey together to see exactly how one historical text navigates every single one of these intellectual eras. So let's jump back to the 1920s. A scholar named Sayyid Nursi was directly addressing that rising tide of materialism in his text That Asaliya Nur. The intellectual climate of his day was desperately trying to explain away anything metaphysical. Now, Nursi countered this, not by rejecting science actually, but by reframing it. He argued that the incredibly intricate, mathematically precise order of the universe couldn't possibly be the result of just random unconscious matter. Think about it like this. If you see a beautifully written book, you don't assume the ink just spilled itself into perfect sentences, right? Nursi applied that exact same logic to the observable universe, laying down an incredibly robust framework to counter the purely materialist worldview that was taking over. Now, what is truly fascinating here is the context of how this was written. Nursi didn't have a crystal ball. He couldn't foresee CRISPR gene editing or the Hubble Space Telescope or ChatGPT. He was simply building a philosophical and theological argument based on fundamental principles of logic and observation. He was just trying to address the materialism right in front of him. Yet, because he attacked the very root of materialist thinking, rather than getting bogged down in the superficial science of his day, he built this foundational structure that unwittingly prepared itself for the future. All right, let's fast forward to the 1960s and 80s. The intellectual landscape shifted big time. A new wave of atheism emerged to challenge theological texts with serious renewed vigor. This era brought a massive resurgence of skepticism, and it was heavily fueled by rapid, mind-blowing advancements like the space race and early genetic mapping. The debates became way more public and seemingly way more modernized. Theological frameworks were suddenly being put under a totally new kind of microscope, and the pressure on historical religious texts to stay relevant was just higher than ever before. But here is the kicker. When you strip away all that contemporary rhetoric of the time, like the early debates on genetics or space exploration, the core philosophical assertions against theology were pretty much identical to the 1920s. It was quite literally the same old arguments in new packaging. The critics were still pointing to physical mechanisms and basically claiming that the mechanism itself was the creator. And because the core logical fallacy hadn't actually changed, Nursi's original framework had already completely covered this ground. The answers to these supposedly new challenges were already sitting right there, having been articulated decades prior. So then we hit the 1990s and 2000s, and the conversation shifts to these celebrity atheists. Think Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, who leaned really heavily into evolutionary biology to argue their points. But watch how fast things change. Just a decade later, the focus narrowed drastically. By the 2010s, thinkers like Stephen Hawking and Lawrence Krauss completely pivoted to theoretical physics. They started arguing that gravity and quantum fluctuations meant the universe could literally come from nothing. The packaging became intensely scientific, moving at breakneck speed from biology straight into specialized cosmology. Yet, the really remarkable takeaway from our source material is that Nursi's reasoning was still standing. Why? Well, because his arguments were rooted in the absolute fundamental impossibility of something coming from absolutely nothing, and the sheer inability of blind, unconscious causes to create perfectly ordered systems. Whether the critics were using the vocabulary of 1990s biology or 2010s theoretical physics, they were still, at the end of the day, arguing that unconscious laws could somehow play the role of a conscious creator. Nursi's logic effortlessly dismantled this by pointing out a simple truth. The laws of nature are exactly that, just laws. They are not the lawmaker. Which brings us to today. In the 2020s, the intellectual landscape has shifted once again, and man, is it a wild frontier. We aren't just debating the origins of the cosmos anymore, we're looking inward and outward at the exact same time. The conversation today is incredibly complex, dominated by fields that didn't even conceptually exist, at least not in the way we understand them, a century ago. We have officially entered the dizzying era of the digital mind and the subatomic mystery. Right now, we are hyper-focused on artificial intelligence, quantum consciousness, and these really deep, almost unsettling questions about will and awareness. We're asking things like, are machines truly aware? Can code actually possess a soul? But even as we wrestle with these highly modern dilemmas, the source material points out that the arguments laid out in the 1920s by Nursi are still shedding incredible light on the topic. For instance, Nursi draws this super sharp distinction between a mere reflection of knowledge, like a mirror reflecting the sun, and the actual source of that light. That perfectly maps onto today's AI debate. I mean, an algorithm might brilliantly reflect human knowledge, but it fundamentally lacks its own conscious will or true independent awareness. So, we've traveled from 1920s positivism all the way to 2020s artificial intelligence. Let's just pause for a second and zoom out to look at the big picture. What is the one philosophical resolution that ties this entire century of rigorous debate together? With all these shifting questions and constantly changing scientific paradigms, what is the anchor? The answer is Tawhid, the concept of profound, interconnected oneness. This is the unchanging answer to a century of evolving questions. Tawhid represents a unified, singular source of existence and order in the universe. It's about recognizing that every single atom, every biological cell, and every cosmic law ultimately points back to a single, conscious creator. Whether the question is phrased through the lens of early 20th century biology, late 20th century secularism, or 21st century astrophysics and AI, this foundational concept of oneness remains an incredibly steady, comprehensive response to all the complexities of existence. And for us, navigating the modern world, maybe you're scrolling through a news feed right now, feeling completely overwhelmed by the latest terrifying update on AI or quantum computing. This offers a massive intellectual anchor. It shows that while humans will endlessly invent new, highly complex ways to ask why and how, a deeply rooted philosophical framework provides lasting clarity. You really don't need to panic every time a new scientific theory is published. When you understand the underlying reality of existence, you realize that the fundamental truth doesn't crumble just because the packaging of the question happens to be more modern. We've seen 100 years of shifting paradigms, right? From basic materialism to quantum mechanics, and they've all been met by the exact same enduring framework of oneness. The core issues of existence, consciousness, and origin haven't actually changed. We've merely upgraded the vocabulary we use to debate them. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this to ponder. If the questions continuously change their packaging, but the foundational answer remains incredibly steady and untouched by time, what will the next century ask?